All right. So, as a bit of context, again, the team behind this is myself, Kelley, and Sarina Dayal, who I think is on a leadership retreat today, but she works at Candid and has been a really thoughtful partner on all this. A couple of months ago, and we'll get, I think in the next slide we get to it, but a couple of months ago, we came together. Oh, so first of all, just the conversation today, we're going to give a bit of an overview on this project that the three of us have been working on and the timeline, what we've been doing, what's coming up next. Kelley will go over the mission, vision, and values, which is sort of the first output of this project, and it's still draft, but it's in a pretty interesting place. Then we'll get into the real details of what we're thinking about governance models, and this is the big decision that needs to be made. And again, we've made some progress with accountability partners. And finally, opening this up for the group here to ask questions, have reflections, and talk about next steps. So for context, I'm not sure I can get these dates exactly right, but somewhere in the middle of early pandemic, the PGM community was born. It definitely came out of some earlier collaborations, including the Ariadne group, and also a collaborative of some of the folks on this call, including Katie and Kelley, who had been, saying we need to think about how to connect the dots around participatory grant making. It started off as a listserv with maybe 24 people, and today it has 700 plus people, and a really incredible group of traditional funders, participatory grant makers, and folks around that world. But as the community has grown so rapidly, we realized, right now we're sort of governing this community on a very ad hoc way, and in line with our values around equity and participation, we realized we wanted to create a participatory governance model that will define really all decisions made. Is this a community that we want to keep growing? Is this a community that is going to be putting out reports? Are we going to have partnerships with different communities and organizations? These are all very big picture questions, but the first question is who decides? Which is obviously very relevant to how we think about grant making. So we launched this in June 2021. Kelley, Sarina, and I started chatting in August. We invited accountability partners, some longtime community members who are deeply involved in the PGM world to provide feedback over the winter. And we had good conversations in December and January. And since then, we've been incorporating their feedback. And so again, the two pieces that we'll discuss that are the sort of linchpins of this project are the mission and values of the community, and then the governance structure. I think we'll get into both today.
Cool. Thanks, Ben. Yay, so I'm excited to share our mission, vision, and values. I wish I had Math's piano and someone could do like a drum roll. Yes, but here it is. This is, a draft that we've been working with, and like Ben said, we got feedback from both our internal volunteer group and also a group of external accountability partners. So basically, our mission is the participatory grant-making community is a global collective of individuals and organizations interested in sharing knowledge and practice to improve participatory grant-making and encourage its use within philanthropy. Our work is that we support each other through peer-to-peer learning, resource sharing, and advocacy. And our vision is that we believe that when grant-making processes are designed and owned by communities themselves, that philanthropy will be more effective, democratic, and just. Yeah, and then I think the values were probably where we had like the richest conversation. And I'll just say that these are sort of highlights from those values. So we're happy to share the longer draft version of this where we really get into a lot more detail. But at a high level, we believe in self-determination. We're rooted in values of anti-oppression and equity. We value accountability and transparency. And we move with care, love, and joy. And so these are the values that sort of drive how we work and how we want to show up with each other. And then I'll just say that we had a lot of really interesting discussions about like who we are and who we want to center. And so we wanted to make sure that in the community, we were very inclusive and that anybody could really join, whether you're sort of just curious about participatory grant making or whether you've been doing it for 10 years. We really wanted to be open. And so we came up with this definition that's we include people who are working within foundations, funders, and with donors who are basically actively working to transform existing power dynamics to move decision making to communities. So that was sort of like our target audience. And then we wanted to be really clear that in terms of who we center and who we want to be like driving our strategy, is the people who are like at the very center of this work. And so we came up with this definition for community-led funders. So the idea is that these are the organizations where they have really embedded like community members and community decision making in every aspect of their organization, from the board to staff to decision makers. And so we wanted to put this on here because this really informs our governance, because we wanted to make sure that the people that we center are the ones who are driving the decision making, and while also naming that everybody is welcome to be a part of the community.
All right, so we're going to get a little in the weeds now on governance design. And as Kelley knows, this has been a passion of ours over the past few months because this can get pretty wonky pretty fast, but we're going to keep it high level. So ultimately, governance is about how people choose to organize themselves, share power and responsibilities, and then ultimately implement the decisions that are made. And it all comes back to this question: who decides, and who decides who decides? And as the next slide, I think, shows, we really wanted to approach this. It would have been maybe easier to just say, hey, we'll make a board for this community, and maybe the board will include some of the donors to the community, or potentially just create a nonprofit. But we wanted to challenge ourselves a little bit. We know from a lot of the conversations that have happened in this space that typical nonprofits have a lot of challenges. There's often a scarcity mindset. The philanthropy in general, it has power dynamics and issues around decision making. And we wanted to challenge the idea of traditional hierarchy, and make sure that as we were creating essentially a new power structure to govern a community of 800 people, we wanted to do it in an authentic way, and one that aligned with our values that we put out. So for folks who are interested, feel free to Slack Kelley and I, or reach out. There's this whole world of, it's really an exciting and growing world of self-governance models. Sociocracy and holacracy are two of the sort of big ones. And these are generally decentralized self-governance systems, where people in organizations, these could be for-profit corporations, these could be nonprofits, they could be governments, but in general, decisions are made collaboratively and in more of a consensus-based environment. So we have been working with a consultant, we've been chatting with folks in the community, and we're going to share our initial direction for what we see as the best governance model for this community. So our proposed initial structure, this slide and then the next slide will have some more information. There are two main circles. And the idea of a circle is that it in some ways operates similar to a board, in some ways it's very different. Sort of at the highest level, there is this accountability circle. The purpose of the accountability circle is to ensure that we are sticking with our mission, vision, and values, that anything we do ultimately it ties back to those. They approve high-level direction. They do review the annual budget. And they are sort of the final say over big picture decisions, as well as weighing in from time to time on more day-to-day decisions as they rise to that level. And this is honorariums will be provided for their time. Operations Circle is a bit different. And it is made up of volunteers and potentially some paid staff who are involved in other elements of the community's work. They are more involved with day-to-day financial, programmatic, operational activities. And it gets a little more complicated, where in some cases there will be honorariums, in some cases there won't. But there, you'll see on the next slide, maybe Kelley, you can go to the next one, that there are some additional circles that I think might help make this clear. So the accountability circle sort of sits above everything else and makes sure that we are staying on track. The operations circle intersects with three subcircles. One has to do, and by the way, these three could end up being four. I think this is where we have a bit of leeway, but broadly encompassing, finance, which are the traditional fundraising and finance roles, budget, and how do we make decisions about money. Programs and programmatic has to do with these monthly sessions and simply the ton of work that goes into right now just managing these really valuable sessions. And Yelena on this call has been doing really incredible work there so far. And finally, communications. This is my background. I'm a comms person, and from the website to managing and facilitating social media or Slack conversations to incoming PR requests. And if if ultimately we decide we want to go a little bigger, pitching out, external PR requests. So ultimately these subcircles will kind of flow in and out with the operations circle. And that's where it gets really interesting. But essentially that all ties back to accountability and operations.
Great. Yeah, so the next three slides are very text heavy, but I wanted to, it feels important for me to sort of just name them out loud. And a big one is just this idea that a lot of these forms like holacracy or sociocracy, they don't necessarily solve for equity. And a lot of like how you solve for equity, from what I've learned, comes from culture norms. And I just feel like it's really important to say that, because I think a lot of times you think like, oh, we'll get this new governance system in place, but then it still can be like upholding or repeating the existing power dynamics within a group. And so just to name that, like dismantling white supremacy culture is like work that everybody needs to be doing actively and needs to be prioritized in the community by making time to talk about it and to talk about how it shows up. And I think especially like one of the things that I've heard a lot about this is that explicit rules are really necessary. And so it might feel a little bit like, oh, why do we have to follow these like strict meeting rules? But what the issue is that when you don't, that's sort of like where oppression shows up. Like oppression will sneak in unless you have like really strict guidelines to keep it out. And so I just wanted to name that aspect of the work that feels really important. So a lot of this was borrowed from the Sustainable Economies Law Center, which I want to give a shout out to because it's an amazing, amazing resource if any of you aren't familiar with it. But they basically are a worker self-directed nonprofit, and they do a lot of sharing about how they do that and what they've learned. And so these are just some high level like policies and practices that they've seen work really well for them. And so I sort of took them and adjusted them for this community to just show how this might look practically in terms of our governance and roles and responsibilities. And then there's, additional policies and practices around transparency and accountability and internal communication. And I think the theme here is just really making sure that things are transparent, information is shared widely, and just like there's this idea, I think, in traditional structures that big important decisions are made by a small group of people, and they kind of flip that on their head and instead say, actually, the more important a decision is, the more people should have a say in that through consensus-based decision making. And so just naming some of those things that are really inspiring us in this work.
All right, so next steps, and this is where we're going to open up for conversation. We are working with a consultant, Harmonize, and maybe Kelley, you could maybe put the link in there. They have helped a number of different organizations create these kinds of decentralized structures. So we are going to basically build out the nuts and bolts of what does this look like and create a handbook. We'll probably have a version of the handbook that's 90 pages long and a version of the handbook that's 10 pages long, so that we can make it easier to read. But essentially we need to figure out things like what is the process for electing people to the accountability circle? We had some really interesting conversations with our consultant yesterday, and he brought up some ideas around like ranked choice voting and sort of these interesting matrices that could make sure it's an equitable process. Something that's worked well in other similar governance models is a liaison roles, like paid roles that communicate between the different circles and sort of act as that they're communicating. They're the thread that ties the different circles together. So that's something that we're going to look into the functionality of. And then there's also just this bigger question about how we adapt it to legal structures. Does it make sense to incorporate as a nonprofit versus for-profit versus not incorporate at all? And how does that relate to legal structures in the US, in the UK, and elsewhere? So Kelley, I think we wanted to just open it up for questions and reflections. Was there anything else, Kelley, that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I'll just say I put the names of some of the groups that have been inspirational to us in here just to give credit. I think we've mentioned both of the organizations except Zebras Unite. Zebras Unite is a really cool co-op that's all about, in the tech space, there's like a lot of focus on unicorns and less focus on like zebras is what they call themselves, is when they're, like more like social entrepreneurs. And so it's a group of zebras. They call themselves a sparkle, and you can join them. It's a co-op, and they have a lot of great thinking around this. Yeah,
we wanted to just open the floor. Yeah, just open the floor for questions and reflections. Yeah, start with that.
I just want to say I'm in awe, but a lot of work, and I can just appreciate that you're not reinventing the wheel, and you're really honoring everything we've been trying to do with participatory grant making in the first place. So thank you, and everybody else who's worked on it. It looks exciting for a governance project.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been fun.
This is Diana. I want to echo the thanks, and it's really fun. I love this part of any project, which is the creative stage and the philosophical stage, and kind of how do you make an idea into reality. But I guess one question I have is, how different do you think it is going to be from like a typical nonprofit structure? Because the accountability circle does kind of remind me of a board. What will be different? And the operations circle reminds me of kind of a management team, or the top leadership of a nonprofit, with, of course, the different aspects of finance and all of that. So what do you think are the main differences?
I can jump in. I have a lot of thoughts about this. I mean, I think one thing that we've definitely been thinking about is like in the US, and I believe in the UK as well, you're not allowed to pay board members. Is kind of like a key feature. I'm not sure if it's a feature, a key rule. And I do think that's challenging. That's a challenging dynamic, because I think then you have a certain amount of privilege in order to be on a board. And I also have seen in the nonprofits I've worked at that the board doesn't always represent like the community who we want to be accountable to. And I know that a lot of people are thinking through how to change that. And so I think that, to me, those are the key things, is we want to make sure the people who are making the decisions are the people who we want to be accountable to, and we want to figure out how to pay them for their time. And some of this is interesting because the group we've been working with, Harmonize, they've sort of said like it's important first to figure out how you want to be together and how you want to make decisions, and then you can kind of figure out how to squish that into one legal form or another. And so in the UK, they do have like a membership version of like a nonprofit, which is really interesting. And so we've definitely talked about like, could this be a membership organization structure so that we can bring more of that sort of thinking into it. But those were the things that kind of come to mind to answer your question.
Yeah, and I would add, I think that some of it has to do with how decisions are made within these structures where, and I'm not an expert on this topic yet, this is where our consultant will be helpful, but there's the difference between consensus and consent decisions where the people who are making the decisions will vary depending on the type of decision. So my understanding is that the subcircles and the operation circle will be very fluid, where people flow in and out of them depending on their availability and interest in different projects. So it might be in some ways similar to a management team, but it would be an amorphous management team that has people coming in and out of it and more self-directed in that way. I do think, Diana, it's a good point that the accountability circle functionally has similar roles to a board, and I think we'd be very curious for ways that we can make sure that we're not replicating those same issues that boards tend to have.
Thanks to both of you. I think one question I had put in the chat was, what will there be term limits for anybody in any circle? Because I think that's a key to ensuring both diversity as well as accountability and just different ways of managing decision making. So have you thought about that?
Yeah, I would say absolutely.
Yeah.
We're going to do term limits. Yeah. Right now, a lot of the subcircles are volunteer run, so I wouldn't want to keep people from volunteering, but it's definitely a co-creative process at the moment where like the forms are like emerging, and we're also like bringing forms and sort of seeing how they all fit together.
Yeah, I think Diana, one thing that we'd love your help on is this question of when does a decision rise to the level of like going to the whole community for input. I think we don't fully have a sense of what that would look like yet, but that would be also something that the accountability board group would decide on. I think that would be really interesting. When can we fully democratize the decision and bring it to the larger community, or maybe everyone in a subcircle, right? So that not every decision is being made by the accountability circle.
That's an evergreen question for managers and leaders. Which decisions get made by whom? I'm happy to jump into the fire on that one, but I can't claim to have great evergreen answers, because I think it is also a moving target, and everybody gets it wrong. And I think just probably the best way to handle it is to be humble and to say, we're going to do our best. We're going to get some things wrong. We're going to, make some decisions people don't like. We want you to say when you don't like it, and we'll, try to do it better next time around. I mean, I think that's all that one can really do as any kind of hierarchical role.
Yeah. Kate, did you have something to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to everybody who's been involved in developing this. And I've had a little bit of sight of this earlier on, but I think it's just so interesting and so joyful, really, and brilliant that you're looking at different non-hierarchical models, and because there's not a model out there to choose, this is really a kind of cutting edge work. And I'm just wondering, there's a couple of things, I suppose. Where can this be shared for kind of wider iteration in terms of both the community of practice and practicing participatory grant making, but generally per se in terms of society and democratizing society? But coming back to where are decisions made and when is everybody who is part of the community involved in those decisions? As somebody who's previously been in a cooperative model in the UK, which is the membership model, and actually facilitating that model for a wider group of tenants and residents, and everybody having a final say, the opportunity to have a final say in the huge decision of whether they felt that they wanted a group of tenants to take over the management of a huge housing estate, then it was about how do you ensure that everybody making that decision has sufficient information to be able to make an informed decision. So it's just about taking that on board, as well as, because there can be quite significant decisions, but how do you ensure that everybody's at a point of understanding that they can contribute fully to making to their vote, having just also experienced our referendum in the UK, where that was not necessarily, and not everybody was informed fully on making that decision, and it didn't particularly have a fabulous outcome. It's just something to be aware of.
For those of us not in the UK, is there a particular referendum you're referencing?
Yeah, our referendum on participate. Do we want to be a member of the EU or do we not want to be a member of the EU? A very simple question, obviously, with no kind of complexity to it whatsoever.
Yeah. To answer the first part of your question, which was like, where else can we share this out? I mean, feel free, everyone, to sort of share if you're seeing this conversation happening other places. I've been kind of geeking out and tracking the space. And so the groups that I mentioned are the ones I found in the US that are really having these conversations. Harmonize website has a ton of resources of other organizations that are sort of thinking through different models. And then in the UK, there's a group called the Transformational Governance Stewarding Group. I don't know if anyone's come across them, but they're doing like some deep dive research into thinking about like what transformational governance will look like. And so I've been connected with them a little bit. I think they're out of a group called like Dark Matter Labs or something like that. So yeah, I mean, I think we hope that we would share all of this widely. I know there's a lot of people who are sort of co-creating this space right now. And I think a lot of people feeling sort of like the governance structures that exist are limiting. So, how can we take the best from all these experiments that are happening and out there. Yeah, and then I'll just say, like, in terms of big group decision making, it's definitely a conundrum, and we're thinking about it and talking about it. And we had a really great conversation with Harmonize yesterday about having like a group where their only job is to decide where and how decisions get made. So they don't make the decisions, you go to them and then they say, this group needs to be informed, this group decides, but that's their only role, is to do that, like an air traffic control kind of thing. And they've seen that work really well. So it's also fun to hear about like different things different groups are trying and how they're working. And we do expect to make mistakes and learn from those and try to be transparent about the process.
There's one more thing I wanted to just put out there, because I think it's a nuance. It's important, is that I think the purpose of the governance in the first, let's say, 6 months to a year of this community, over the next, let's say, first year that this governance model is implemented, I think will look different than moving forward, because there are some decisions to make about, what do we want to be when we grow up? What is the purpose of this community? Looking at the mission and values and making sure that they're on track. And then I think there's more of a maintenance, and how do you make decisions on a more regular basis and review an annual budget. But I think the first time we do everything that will require a certain set of decisions. And then, moving forward, it will be more of a maintenance and continuation and steady expansion. So I just think that's an interesting thing to think about, that there's almost those two different pieces. Millie?
Yeah, thank you all so much. I think it looks amazing as well. And I would love to know more about the details, about how you got there. And I was just wondering what you have in mind for training, just recognizing that Well, like for example, I had a grantee who was really interested by the teal model, and we gave them some capacity building money, and they also struggled to kind of integrate that racial equity lens. And I would say in the end, they kind of ended up back to the hierarchical, and so I wonder if it will take, what it will take for all of us, when we've all lived in these hierarchical models for so long, and, kind of this, the default to, to get new muscles around different ways of being. And I'm wondering how you're thinking about how to help the community move forward on that.
That's such a great question.
Yeah, I mean, we've thought about training, and we're chatting with Harmonize about the best way to implement that training. So that will be a piece of it. I think it's important to call out that this is this will be an evolving governance model, and one of the questions that the I think accountability community will revisit every year is, how is this governance model working out, and should there be any adaptations to how we do it? So I could see a world where right now we are sort of bucketing things into comms and finance and operations because that's how we know how to do it. But as we go along and we start to see and learn more about this process and understand the ways that the community works together, maybe the subcircles could be rearranged to something that's a bit more fluid. So I just think that's important to call out, that there is room for this to grow and evolve after sort of the initial parameters are set.
Yeah, and I think that's where the culture piece comes in. It's so important to not just change the structures, but also change ourselves and like reflect on how we show up when we come to this work. And so we've started a little bit with the working group. The working group is like the current group that runs the organization, just in case anyone's wondering. And we've tried to make time in our meetings to do reflections on like white supremacy culture. And I think that's something we could do more of, just to make sure that we're really sitting with the ways that those structures keep showing up. So. Yeah, and I want to make sure that we have time to do like one round of peer coaching in case that's why you showed up today. So maybe I'll just say, like, if there's any other burning questions, this is obviously like a work in progress and an ongoing conversation. And so like, thank you all for sharing your thoughts and ideas, and keep it coming. Ben and I are both on Slack and the Google group, I believe. And we'll share all of this out. We'll share the deck and the full mission, vision, values out with everybody after this call. So yeah. Thank you all. I'm gonna stop the recording.